Hello everyone, I'm David Ringstrom, a CPE in Atlanta, and welcome to our presentation that is an introduction to macros. If you've not presently worked with macros in Excel, they are a means of creating programming code that you can play back to automate repetitive tasks. Macros are a big topic, and so we're going to ease our way into it. And in this session, we're going to be focused primarily on using the macro recorder feature in Excel. It's a feature that's tucked away on Excel's view menu that we can use to turn on and kind of use like a video camera to automate repetitive tasks. So what we'll do is we'll turn on the macro recorder and carry out our work. And then once we're done, then we'll have the programming code that we can then play back and use to automate repetitive tasks such as cleaning up reports and so on. The macro recorder itself does have some limitations. It cannot make any decisions. It can't deal with variations in our data, but it is a good starting point for introducing the concept of macros. And you may be surprised as you work with it, you may find more and more things that you can automate with the macro recorder. From there, though, we'll move on in the next part of the series to working more hands-on with programming code, and that's when we can really have more control over automating our repetitive tasks. I do like to start out with a little bit of background about my materials and my teaching style. I do try to accommodate you no matter what version of Excel you might be using, which could be Excel 2007, 10, 13, or 16. For the material that we're working with in this presentation, everything should look and feel the same way across all four versions. If by chance I've included anything that is unique to one of the newer versions, then I'll make sure to point that out. But pretty sure for this set of material, everything is going to be the same across all four versions of Excel. I will demonstrate everything at least twice. I will first walk you through it on the PowerPoint slides, which are very detailed and have numbered steps. And then I'll go over to Excel 2016 and carry out those techniques firsthand. So I do try to leave you with a lot of takeaways from choosing one of my presentations. Let's get a sense of what a macro is and how we can use it in the context of this presentation. For most of this presentation, we're going to be making use of what's called the macro recorder. To get there, we will first go to the View menu in Excel. Step 2, we'll then see there's a Macros command, and there's two portions of that button. There's a top portion and a bottom portion. When we click the bottom portion, that pulls down a menu from which we'll be able to view macros, turn on the macro recorder, and also choose Use Relative References. So when we turn on the macro recorder and carry out an action in Excel, behind the scenes, Excel transforms most of those actions into programming code that can play back. Now, I say most because there are some catches with the macro recorder, and there are certain actions you can do in Excel that won't be recorded, such as switching menus and so on, but anything that you do that involves interacting with the worksheet or changing any characteristic of Excel, that's what gets transformed into programming code. Now, there are also what are known as user forms, and that's an advanced feature that's beyond the scope of this presentation, but just to give you a sense of what's possible, we can create user forms that allow us to build our own customized interactive forms. We can have checkboxes, drop-down list, fill in the blank fields, option buttons, command buttons that carry out an action when we click on them, and so on. So it's just a glimpse of if you did choose to pursue macros further down the line, you would gain some familiarity with creating user forms. In Excel, we see we can go to the View menu, over to the right, top portion, we click, that's the View Macros. It will give us a list of any macros that are available to us. There aren't any yet because I've not created any. If we go to the bottom portion, we get a repeat of the View Macros command. Also, the Record Macro command we're making a lot of use of. We'll also see instances where we need to use Relative References. Let's begin with an introduction to Excel's macro recorder. And so that feature is tucked away on Excel's View menu. And so you may not have noticed before, the macros command is the last command at the right on the View menu. And if we pull down that macros command, we'll then see that there's a choice to record the macro. Now, when we turn on the macro recorder, not every action we take is going to get recorded. Only actions that actually affect the workbook itself or the worksheet. So when you're browsing, if you turn on a macro recorder and then you're kind of tooling through the menus, it's not going to keep track that you activated this menu or that menu. What it instead, when things get recorded, is when you actually carry out something that changes the workbook in some fashion. So moving around in the menus doesn't change the workbook. Typing some data, saving the file, rearranging the windows, adding a sheet, and so on, those types of actions do change the workbook. And so that's the type of actions that then get saved or get transcribed into programming code for us by the macro recorder. But let's just do a simple example. If you pick up pretty much any book about programming, the first exercise is often some riff on making the macro or the script or the programming code return the words hello world. And so we'll do something similar here to just get our feet wet and see what the process is from start to finish on creating a macro by way of the macro recorder. Step 1, we're going to click on any cell within our worksheet. Step 2, we'll choose the macros command from the view menu. And we want the bottom portion of the macros command. There's a top portion and a bottom portion. We want the bottom portion here with the arrow so that we can then see the menu that pops down. That step 3 there is the choice for record macro. That brings up a record macro dialog box. And so step 4, we'll give our macro a name. We'll call it hello. And then step 5, we want to store our macro in a special place that's known as the personal macro workbook. What's unique about this workbook, it's a hidden workbook that Excel manages on its own. Any macros that you place within it become available to you to use with all your future Excel workbooks. So anything that you place in the personal macro workbook will just always be an extension of your Excel environment. So step 6, there's a description field where we can describe what our macro does, because sometimes just based on the name we might not remember what the macro does. So we can give it a description. Step 7, when we click OK, it's kind of like clicking the record button on our phone to record some video, much the same idea. So Excel then starts watching to see if you're making any changes that affect the worksheet. So step 8 there, we're going to type in the words hello world, and we'll press enter. When we initiate the macro recorder, a new shortcut will appear at the bottom of our screen as evidenced by step 9. So a stop recording button will appear down on the status bar next to where it says ready. Now, if for some reason that status bar is not present on your screen, or if you don't see that button there, you would also be able to go back to the macros menu, and where it says record macro, that would have changed at this point with the macro recorder running to be a stop recording button. But typically you'll find it easier to click that square at the bottom of the screen. The other benefit to that square is it serves as a reminder that the macro recorder is on. Many times it can be easy to forget to turn the macro recorder off, and so we want to make sure that we turn it on, carry out our work, and then turn it off so we don't record extraneous items in our macro. So once we've turned off the macro recorder, step 10 there, we will once again go back to the view menu if needed. Step 11, we'll click the top portion of the macros button. That brings up a macro dialog box. That will then give us a list of the macros in our workbook. So step 12 there, we'll click on the name of our macro, which is our hello macro. Step 13, we'll click run. And at that point, we should see the words hello world appear in another worksheet cell. To try this out here, I've got a blank workbook and my cursor is in cell A1. So I'm going to go to the view menu. Going to go then to the macros command and come down and then choose record macro. So when I make that choice, that brings up the record macro dialog box. I'll give the macro a name. I cannot have any spaces in the name. If I try to type a name that has any invalid characters, Excel will stop me when I click OK. So you do need to keep the words all contiguous, maybe as compound words, or you can use an underscore in place of a space. There's an enticing spot here for the shortcut key. We want to leave that blank because that can cause more problems than it solves. I'll show you once we have vetted our macro and we're sure that it works properly, how we can go back in and add a shortcut key in that fashion as we wish. But there's also another, I think, better way to create keyboard shortcuts for macros that we'll get to. So we're going to store our macro in the personal macro workbook. Notice we pull this list down, we could store it in a new workbook or the workbook that we're currently in. And we'll have reasons to save them in other workbooks, but many of our macros are just going to be things to help us automate repetitive tasks that we find ourselves carrying out over and over again. And so if we keep them in the personal macro workbook, then they'll always be at the ready for us to run when we're working in Excel. So we'll call this my first Excel macro. And then we'll click OK. So at this point, the macro recorder is recording. If I'm not sure, I can go back to the macros command and notice that there then says stop recording. And so if I'm navigating through the menus, nothing's getting recorded yet. I haven't made any changes that affect the worksheet or the workbook. So in cell A1, we're going to type the word hello, put the word world, exclamation mark, we'll press enter. And then at this point, we'll click the stop recording button.